The Legend of Zelda is one of my favorite gaming franchises of all time. This series is full of incredible adventures, and each one is valuable in different ways. These games mean so much to me personally, and I constantly replay them to feel that special Zelda magic that no other games can recreate. Originally, I was going to make a top 10 Zelda games video, but it felt wrong to rank these games in such an oversimplified way when each has so much to offer. Plus, it was really hard to try and decide which games were my favorite, so instead I'm making this video as a sort of love letter to this series. It can sometimes be hard to put into words why I love Zelda so much, but that's exactly what I'm going to try and do today. So join me in taking a look back at this amazing franchise, as I try to explain why I love The Legend of Zelda. Starting with probably the first thing you'll notice when playing any Zelda game, the visuals and world building. Right from the beginning of the adventure, you'll be taken to another world, full of beautiful fantasy landscapes and locations. The opening areas of Zelda games are always so special, like Kokiri Forest, Outset Island, Skyloft, and the Great Plateau. These starting locations introduce you to the world while giving you a safe place to learn and practice the mechanics of the game. Then you'll set off to save the day and travel across tons of creative and distinct areas with gorgeous visuals. There are so many places that I just love spending time in. Each Zelda game has a unique art style, which is a huge reason why I love this series so much. The developers never get too comfortable with one style. They're constantly trying something totally fresh and original. There's the cel-shaded cartoon style of The Wind Waker, the realistic and mature look of Twilight Princess, the watercolor artistic feel of Skyward Sword, and Breath of the Wild's art style feels like a combination of everything that came before it. All these amazing art styles are great in their own way, and they help keep the franchise interesting 35 years later. For example, I didn't really like the toy-like art style of the 2019 Link's Awakening remake, but over time it really grew on me, and now I can say it's another Zelda art style I love. The world building is another important aspect of a good Zelda game, where the visuals mix with interesting lore and history to make a believable world that feels alive. All the different areas flow together naturally, creating a seamless world that makes sense and feels like it could really exist. You can tell from the insane amount of Zelda theories out there that people love diving deep into the lore of these games. The Zelda timeline might be complicated and confusing, but we all love it anyway because The Legend of Zelda has such fascinating mythology and secrets. I proudly own a copy of Hyrule Historia, and I love reading all the facts and details about this series. Even years later, people are still talking and theorizing about games like Ocarina of Time, which shows just how much depth there is to these worlds. There is so much imagination and creativity poured into the visuals and world building in Zelda games, and it makes them so much fun to play through, leaving us with great memories that last for years. The story and characters in Zelda games are always incredibly good, with tons of memorable people you get to meet and truly epic moments that happen along the way to the end credits. Like the art style, each Zelda game has a very different approach to story. While each game may follow a similar structure of dungeons and princess saving, they're presented in very different ways. A Link to the Past and A Link Between Worlds have light and dark worlds where the player travels between the two different versions of Hyrule consistently. Majora's Mask has a super unique 3-day time loop setup that places importance on planning out your schedule carefully to accomplish everything you want to. And Breath of the Wild throws almost all of the structure out the window and lets the player explore the world freely and make their own decisions. But the structure isn't the only way Zelda games have different stories. The tone of the story also varies a lot between titles. Majora's Mask and Twilight Princess have darker tones that place more emphasis on creepiness, while the Wind Waker and the DS titles have an overall brighter and happier tone. Even the motivation for the hero changes between games, like in Link's Awakening where the goal is to get off the island and wake the Windfish. I really love Link's motivation in Twilight Princess, where the goal isn't to save the princess right away. Instead, you're fighting to rescue the children from the village you grew up in. And in Skyward Sword, you're supposed to save Zelda like usual, but it feels a lot different because the earlier hours of the game set up a romance between Link and Zelda, changing the dynamics of rescuing her. I could keep talking about the overall stories of Zelda games, but let's talk about the many different characters from this series. Each game has a huge cast of characters that inhabit the towns of the world, and they're always so much fun to interact with. The main focus of the story is usually on people like Link, Zelda, and Ganondorf, but some of the best Zelda characters come from smaller roles like Beetle the Shopkeeper. Some standouts include Groose from Skyward Sword, Ravio from A Link Between Worlds, the Happy Mask Salesman from Majora's Mask, and of course there's Tingle too. All these characters help keep every second of your adventure interesting and enjoyable. And I won't get into any spoilers here in case you're still new to the franchise, but the finales of most Zelda games are just amazing as well. By the time you reach the end, you feel like you've really accomplished something and completed your purpose in the story. I believe The Legend of Zelda has told some of the greatest stories in video game history, with an impressive roster of fantastic characters too. While not as obvious as something like the visuals or story, the exploration is another key part of the classic Zelda magic. The world and characters are amazing, but it's the drive to go out and discover that makes playing through these games feel so special. There's always that point in the story where things finally open up after the first couple hours, and you can just run off into the distance and find something amazing. Zelda games are full of side objectives and quests to reward the players who go off the main path. In Majora's Mask, if you just stuck to the main story and only that, you'd miss out on a lot of the game's charm. Majora's Mask is at its best when you're following a certain character around Clocktown out of curiosity and accidentally discover an entire side quest. But out of all the Zelda games, Breath of the Wild is probably the best at giving the player the feeling of discovery and exploration. After the Great Plateau, the entire land of Hyrule is opened up to you, and you can go wherever you want. Around every corner is a shrine, side quest, or Korok seed. Even just finding a cool location on the map feels amazing. All the game mechanics work together perfectly to allow for natural experimentation and discovery. The developers like to call Breath of the Wild an open-air adventure, and I think that's the perfect way to describe it. With almost no limits on the player, it allows you to get totally invested in the game and focus on what's around you in the open world. Even the more linear games like Skyward Sword still give you a feeling of discovery while playing, as traveling across the vast land of Hyrule is so exciting and engaging. For me, exploration is such an important part of the Zelda formula, and the series wouldn't be the same without it. Alongside exploration, the dungeons and combat are another essential part of a great Zelda game. Each entry in the series has multiple dungeons to complete, with each having a distinct visual style and look. There are water, fire, snow, and even shadow-themed dungeons across the franchise, and very few of them are not enjoyable. In my earlier days of playing Zelda games, I actually didn't love playing through the dungeons, and would usually rush through them as fast as possible so I could get back to exploring. But over time, I've really come to appreciate these giant labyrinths full of clever and engaging puzzles. I love spending an hour or two getting lost in the monster-infested rooms of somewhere like the Forest Temple, and sometimes I'm sad once a dungeon is over because they're just so exciting and full of surprises. The usual formula is to get a key item from a treasure chest about halfway through the dungeon, and then use that item to complete the rest of it and defeat the boss. Speaking of bosses, the bosses at the end of Zelda dungeons are almost always incredible, with some real standouts including Bongo Bongo, Mulgera, Stal-Lord, Koloktos, and Monk Maz Koshia. A good boss fight at the end of a long dungeon is almost like a reward because of how fun they are. And the normal enemy designs are always great too, with them usually matching the theme of the area you're currently exploring. I especially love how there are certain enemies that always return across the franchise like the Bokoblin, but have a fresh new look and design for every game. But enemies are only as good as the combat system you use to fight them, and luckily Zelda succeeds at that as well. Swinging Link's sword always feels great, and using all the items you've collected to attack is also amazing. Twilight Princess has some pretty awesome unlockable skills that make the swordplay a lot more engaging and challenging to master, but Breath of the Wild has the most unique combat system out of all of the games. Love it or hate it, weapon durability totally changes the feel of combat, encouraging more on-the-fly thinking and not allowing you to get too comfortable with one setup. The game's physics even play into the combat, like rolling rocks off of cliffs to crush enemies, or using magnesis to throw a giant metal object into a camp of Bokoblins. There are some pretty insane stunts you can pull off using Breath of the Wild's combat system, which shows just how well thought out the mechanics are. But I also still really love the classic approach to combat, where blocking and timing your sword swings is the best strategy. Dungeons and combat both help to keep these long adventures interesting, and make you feel really accomplished when you complete an extra tricky temple or defeat a tough enemy. It's possible that I saved the best for last, because I think the music and atmosphere are some of the most important elements of The Legend of Zelda, and are why we all have such a strong emotional connection to this series. I don't think it's a stretch to say Zelda has some of the best video game music of all time. There are seriously too many memorable tunes to name in this one video. Music makes all the other things I've talked about already so much better. The visuals are enhanced by the fitting music tracks, the story is given so much more gravity thanks to the character themes, exploration is way more enjoyable while listening to energetic overworld music, and dungeons have some amazingly atmospheric songs to listen to while solving puzzles. A lot of Zelda's music has an inherently nostalgic feel to it, so when we go back and listen to the songs from past games we've played, all the great memories come flooding back. But words can only do so much to describe how great the music is, so let's take a listen to some of my favorite songs from this franchise's history. Ocarina of Time has a ridiculous amount of iconic songs, but the title screen theme is probably my favorite. I have to include the triumphant Great Sea theme from The Wind Waker. The overworld music from Spirit Tracks is way better than it should be. Fi's theme from Skyward Sword is hauntingly beautiful and filled with emotion. And kind of a weird last pick, but the music that plays during the attack on Vah Naboris from Breath of the Wild is just fantastic. Okay, that's enough examples, although I could keep going all day. Another part of why the music is so great is the atmosphere it creates while playing. Zelda songs are often what makes certain areas so memorable, combined with the impressive visuals and world design. It's so easy to get fully engrossed in these fantasy lands, and a big reason for that is the soundtrack and atmosphere. I think in general video game music is underappreciated, and The Legend of Zelda is possibly the best example of why it's so important. The Legend of Zelda is a massive video game franchise full of amazing entries and so much to love about each game. It's honestly impossible to cover everything this series has to offer in just one video, but that was my best attempt to show you why I love Zelda so much. I still feel like there was so much I didn't cover, but I'm sure you get the idea. And if you're also a huge fan of this series, then feel free to share all the reasons why you love Zelda in the comments below. I love talking about all the amazing Zelda games from the past, and the future promises to deliver even more fantastic adventures. That's about all I've got for this one, so thanks for watching guys, and I'll see ya in the next one.